You either use the internet for fun or you use the internet to grow. You're here to grow. Welcome to TRS Clips. Would you be open to working with the Indian government?
Potentially, sure. I mean, but with that said, I'm going to work in an area that I think is that I'd make a contribution on.
Maybe exactly this is the main player in the away game, which is Dr. Jaishankar right now. But people like yourself have a massive role to play.
Sure. I mean, I think in terms of like Israel does a lot of stuff with its diaspora. Right. So organizing diaspora, I think, is going to be very important.
In that internet land that we... Boom.
Yes.
Damn.
Right. So the internet Indian will be a very big part of this century.
Can you kind of draw out a practical version of that picture?
Yeah. What does that mean? Right.
Yeah.
So first is, it's just Indians on the ground in every country that, basically on every country in the world, maybe other than China, will just become more and more influential. And here's how I think about that. As I said, there's like 7 million Indians abroad now. And you look at their income and education stats, and they're doing quite well, okay? And they were basically completely non-existent in 1965. So in 50 years, the unlock has been really powerful. And the question is, now we've got 1.4 billion Indians, and on the order of 1 billion have gotten online, and we're going to get all of them online pretty soon, okay? And then the question is, what percentage of those can play at the same level as the 7 million abroad, okay? I actually think it's conservative to say 5%. 5% I think is, because there's some degree of selective migration, right? It's doctors who made it abroad or engineers, okay? But even if it's only 5%, and I think that's conservative, okay? That's 70 million people. That's 10x what's already abroad. Mm-hmm. And what's abroad is already pretty impressive. If you had 10x the number of Indian Americans or Indian Westerners, that would be a massive labor shock in the world, comparable only to China. Right? 70 million people at that ability level is a new Germany. Germany's like 80 million people, right? That's a massive, massive, massive new thing on the world stage, okay? That's what's about to happen. And so what that means is lots of Indian media, India CEOs. One way of thinking about it is by 2040 or so, if you look around your room, almost everything is like made in China. That's the physical world. But an enormous part of the digital world will have the CEO be Indian. Okay. Just the talent there that has gotten, it's like a coiled spring that's about to kind of just go like this, right? And once you actually are put on a fair, level playing field, you do very well. Actually, when I said India is 10x Israel, it's a very deep analogy that goes very far back. One analogy to what is happening now is, I call it Indian emancipation. And this is similar to actually something that happened in the 1800s called Jewish emancipation. Okay, so the Jewish community in Europe used to be totally, they used to be religious, right? So they'd have the long beards, and they'd wear traditional religious garments and so on, and they're very visually distinguishable. And over time, what happened was Jewish people gained civil rights. But before then, before Jewish emancipation, the Jewish communities within Europe were interacted with as like a community level. Like, for example, the head of the community would go to the king, and then they would pay taxes as a group, not any individual, right? They weren't citizens. They were like visitors, okay? It was almost like a corporation was there, and it was there to do business, and then they paid taxes as a group, but any individual wasn't, okay? After emancipation, Jewish people could own property and participate directly and vote and marry, do these various kinds of things as individuals. And one way of thinking about it is, rather than two different networks where this, would pay taxes as a group to this, every node could connect to every other node. Okay. So it became a fully integrated kind of thing. All right. So what is the analogy for us today with Indians? Well, for essentially many years, you had these various other countries that interact with India as a group, right? And then bit by bit, you had Indians emigrating, and they started to get rights as citizens individually. They can interact individually with the rest of the world. And you had Sundar and Satya and so on and so forth. Okay. And now suddenly with the internet, all these Indians can connect to anybody else in the world peer to peer directly, right? You don't have to go through a state. You don't have to do it as a group. You can prove yourself as an individual, right? That is Indian emancipation. Very similar to Jewish emancipation, where all of this talent that had been, because there's a number of very, very talented Jewish people that didn't have opportunity because they didn't have the full rights of citizens, right? And it's like all these Indians here that don't have visas, that couldn't make it abroad, that couldn't really participate in the global marketplace, they're sort of just geo-locked, domain-locked, are not anymore. Okay? So that is this enormous, enormous thing. There's more analogies like this, right? Another analogy, kind of important difference is China and more generally East Asian culture, that they obviously have their own local tradition of writing that goes back thousands of years. It's very subtle and it's amazing in Chinese, okay? But what they export to the world is visual. What I mean by that is, for example, so this is also the same for Japan and Korea. For example, Japan, what does it export to the world? Anime and video games, right? And Hello Kitty and stuff. It's all visual and cute, right? How about Korea? K-pop, right? That's exported to the world. What about China? It's like Hong Kong cinema and now TikTok. All of that is visual, right? It's fundamentally, it's video, it's aesthetics, right? That's what it is. It's not verbal. You don't say, oh, K-pop has amazing lyrics. It's not like the Iliad or the Odyssey where you're talking about it's poetry or whatever, right? It's just the aesthetics are what people like about it. Hong Kong cinema is not known necessarily for its plots. I'm not saying it's terrible, but it's like the kickboxing and the shooting and the cinematography, right? Whereas by contrast, if China and East Asia is visual, India is verbal.
India's verbal.
Is verbal. For example, if you look at the recent Ukraine thing, right? China's foreign minister was on, Qin Gang was on CNN. It was completely unable to defend the Chinese position. This is their foreign minister, someone who's supposed to be fluent in English and American culture. He's speaking in halting English. He can't make his case, on a world stage. Whereas somebody like, obviously Minister Jaishankar, but any Indian anchor, like I saw Arnab Goswami is doing this, Indians argue in English. And so the moment that Americans were saying, oh my God, you're so immoral for not supporting, Ukraine by sanctioning Russia, Indians had 50 arguments ready to go. They're like, well, A, you didn't support India in the Bangladesh war, and B, you supported Pakistan, and C, you sanctioned India when we were getting nuclear weapons versus China, and D, you invaded Iraq, and E, you basically had bin Laden on our border for a long time. We told you he was there, and you didn't do anything. Blah blah blah. Basically, Indians just went with like a zillion arguments back. And suddenly the Americans are totally taken aback because they're not used to somebody who can argue back in English.
Palki Sharma, yeah.
Palki Sharma is another one that's like this. Exactly. She's very good at, she just, takes nothing, and she'll give it back, right? Dashum. See, I know that one, right? Yeah, go ahead.
Go on.
All right.
There's a part of me that's extremely narcissistic here. And I'm thinking that if you're saying it's verbal, and I know in a past interview, I think you had with Tanmay, you said that media is going to be a huge export from India.
Yep.
That means Indian podcasting has a role to play on the global stage as well.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Which is my personal next challenge. I'm trying to figure out how to reach out to the West.
Sure.
But I think they only watch geopolitical and sometimes spiritual stuff. So I'm just trying to figure out how I can expand in the West.
I mean, basically, you should do India one-on-one for Americans.
Do you think they'd watch it?
Yeah, I'd tweet it.
Like, what would that contain? The history?
You need an American on the show with you for that. But basically, assume Americans know nothing about India.
Okay.
Like nothing. Truly nothing. They don't know partition. They don't know Sikhs and Jains and, all the different religions. They don't know that Bangladesh was part of Pakistan, right?
But what's in it for them, even if I do this?
Because now they do know that India is on our side versus China.
Okay.
That's basically.
It's like Steph Curry knows Klay Thompson inside out.
Yeah. It's well, I had this thread, which is actually, I think, an important thread for Indians to be aware of. And we can bring it up on screen or something like that. But it's 1942, ally with Russia to beat Germany. 1972, the U.S. allies with China to beat Russia. 2022, U.S. allies with India to beat China. Okay, this is called offshore balancing. Basically, the number one allies with the number three against the number two until the number two is beaten, then rinse and repeat. Okay, and so what that means is right now, India is being showered with money and attention from the rest of the world in a way that it really hasn't been in a long time, right? And that's good that we have good leadership in place where Modi and Jaishankar, I think, are smart enough to recognize that that requires active balancing. Like they're very smart to keep a foot in BRICS and SCO and host a G20 and so on and so forth, right? And the reason is that war is bad. India is becoming the neutral kind of party. Hey guys, they're not the far left of the woke establishment in the USA, but they're also not the ultra nationalist Han basically Han supremacist right effectively in China. They're in the middle, right? They're the global mediator, right? And that means that they can get investment from potentially. Well, do you get investment from China? Maybe not. But there's certainly a lot of Chinese construction. They have a lot of skills, right? I know there's a TikTok ban and so on, but I feel India's policy towards China is more rational than America's policy towards China. America's policy towards China is, this is, the guys who they thought of as just grinding away in the factory while they were watching Friends have suddenly become their own civilization. Right? Like Americans thought of China as making plastic stuff at Walmart and they'd always be like basically their sweatshop or something like that. And suddenly they're like being really disobedient. That's a very unflattering way of putting it. They'd say, no, it's all about human rights and so on and so forth. That's the only reason we're against China there, because they're human rights. Come on, right? That's not it, right? Like the US cared about human rights in the Middle East, blew up all these places. Now it doesn't talk about human rights in the Middle East. It never cared about human rights in the Middle East, in my view. Okay, unfortunately.
Which is also the worldview, by the way.
Which is also the worldview. That's right. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Dear Americans, I love you guys and we've learned so much from you, but there are aspects of the worldview that will piss you off as patriotic Americans.
Yeah. Human rights is invoked selectively by America and, to delegitimize its next target. Right. And it's something where when it's convenient, okay, you'll do a deal. Like there's a bunch of countries around the world that'll do a deal with them and they'll suspend the human rights thing. They'll be like, okay, no, pragmatism takes place. Well, pragmatism takes place sometimes. It's really taking place all the time, which is fine. I actually don't think even the term human rights steals a lot of bases, right? Because it's like, blowing up the whole Middle East, like, didn't they have the right to live? Like what exactly does it mean, human rights? It's just this term that is optimized for people to sound good or whatever, right? You'd rather have them be alive rather than have, in theory, I'm trying to give a good example of this, like Libya, Syria, Tunisia, Iraq, Afghanistan, all these countries that are blown to smithereens, pushed into chaos for some theoretical future benefit. I don't consider that a human rights policy, right? I think it's it's human results. Maybe that's a good way of putting it, right? Human results over human rights. Like, is their standard of living increasing? Is their life expectancy increasing? Are they at peace, right? Human results versus human rights is just talk, and human results is reality, right? Okay. Point is that when you look at the history of all these alliances, and I did a long thread on this, and there's so many more. Like the U.S. was allied with Iraq against Iran, or basically was playing both sides, and then it was against Iraq. Or it was allied with Osama bin Laden against the Soviet Union. Do you know about that, right? Yeah. And then, of course, it was against. They shook Gaddafi's hand and then blew up Gaddafi. So it needs to just be really cautious, right? And any deal it signs, it should take the money. It should deliver on its side, but it should very carefully negotiate what its side of affairs is. And at no point should it turn itself into Ukraine or even Japan, in the sense of like Ukraine has just become a crumpled up war zone, right? Like, versus Russia. That's what they're trying to turn Taiwan into as well. You do not want to be Ukraine. You don't even want to be Germany, where Germany's also had to like sort of suicide bomb itself, had to destroy its economy. It's deindustrialized. It's paid a massive price. It's like trillions of dollars in cost, 800 billion in just Euro subsidies alone for energy, and more than that, probably when everything is taken into account for this Ukraine war. All of which, you'll hear guys like Romney, saying, "Oh, this is a great investment for us," which is like, well, it's a great investment for Germany, really? And I'm not sure, but it was a great investment for the Ukrainians. I don't really know about that, right? We'll see where where that lands out. Talking about it in that way as a great investment, you'll have quite a few American politicians talking about that. Is that human rights? That's a very instrumental view of use somebody else for your benefit, right? And the US has eased up on its anti-India rhetoric recently. So you notice, remember, the thing, human rights is used to delegitimate those who they don't like. And then it's pushed back on when they're like, you know what, we need this guy for now.
Using media?
Yeah, using media. They basically
using traditional news.
Traditional news, you will literally probably go and see the number of negative articles on Modi has dropped off as...
Damn.
Go and do the natural language processing on this, okay? You'll see the number of negative articles has dropped off as the storyline has changed because they're like, okay, we need them against these guys.
Okay.
Okay. So the reason to know this is if you understand the game, you can win the game.
Okay.
Right? And Indians can do dashum. Like lots of people don't want to think about politics at this level. They'll be like, what are you saying? There are sincerest allies ever, right? No, that's just not the case. It's just not how the USA has been playing for a long time. I'm not saying there aren't sincere Americans. There's lots of good individual sincere Americans who will keep their word and so on and so forth.
I think you're talking about the geopolitical identity.
I'm talking about Washington, D.C., right? Yeah, go ahead.
Have you ever had a WWE watching phase?
I mean, I know the show, yeah.
Geopolitically speaking, America's like Triple H. Mostly dangerous, but can sometimes be a friend.
Well, yeah. So the friend, no. Ally, yes. Yeah. Right? And there's a huge difference also between friend, ally, and enemy of enemy.
You know,
right?
also, this is true for every country. Like, there's no friends in geopolitics. Everyone's an ally to each other. New clips released at the same time that a podcast releases. This is TRS Clips. Make sure you subscribe.